Africa has been revisited by the Chinese in an entirely new light. Having done my own research on the Tanzania lower gauge rail built by the Chinese across Tanzania in the 1960s during Julius Nyerere's rule, it was a major investment for the Chinese. Chinese style was on full display. As the Chinese laborers crossed Africa, they grew their own gardens as they went, and as they had once done on their great ships, stunning the Africans. The 1960s was a period of export, of goodwill and socialism toward socialist brethren by the Chinese, with Julius Nyerere center front in affection. Today, policy is firmly centered around the needs of an industrializing, modernizing, technologically forward-leaping China, who rather desires the exports of computers over socialism. China has returned to Africa with a mission benefiting Africans, with a Chinese proposal, for instance, of investing $8 billion in both Sudans. Certainly roads and other vital infrastructure projects will bring benefit to the oil trade, but it will also benefit the Africans as well. One can simply reference whether the infrastructure is brought to India or South Africa by Great Britain, and the same by the French in the Kingdom of Cambodia, and the three kingdoms of Vietnam were beneficial to those societies. There can be no argument made against China that she has not participated in the well-being of the world. Perhaps it seems self-serving, but what of all global capitalists? The benefit to themselves has had a spin-off effect of benefiting countries in dire circumstances. If one argues that the Chinese just aren't participating in the needs of the world, I would counter that by pointing out that an $8 billion investment for both Sudans is not an insignificant participation in remedying the needs of poor and forgotten countries. But it is being done Chinese style. Maybe that is what upsets us. Again, you may not know what goes on inside plant China, but the outcome is what ought to be observed. Perhaps it comes down to our own discomfort that there is a new world order emerging, and not one we like, nor have anticipated, but emerging it seems to be, led by the Chinese. It is all a product of those careful engineers, and we have no excuse in the West for our growing inferiority, if such is the case, which I hope it isn't. They fought a terrible war and a terrible civil war, and a war in which ideology was waged against the Chinese people. They fought a war against abject poverty for billions of Chinese, and against an ideology that upended their delicate economic resurgence. They learned and came to understand what their goals were and to compete for them. They have arrived, and they are significant. We pride ourselves on our freedom and independence, while we do nothing to prepare for the uncertainty of the future. I think it says it all, that Congress has not passed a budget. It is incomprehensible that when the Democrats had a majority in the House and Senate, that they did not pass a budget. This will go down in history, and no one can change the fact of the past, but it will be pointed to as an example of our squandering our own future. Never mind the arguments that the Republicans are obstructionists. The Democrats had it all, and they threw it away. For what? And why? Those answers will come from future historians. If we cared, we would be martial in our approach to education, as we once were after the Russians, the Soviets, took us to task by excelling and beating us in the space race. If we cared, we would deploy the same sense of urgency to educate our children and become competitors with those careful engineers. We would drag the boomers out of retirement and use them to educate our children. We're fooling around, and the clock is running. The Chinese did not have our wealth, which we have squandered. They have a huge population that they wish to raise up. When I was in Taiwan with my husband, every time our hosts sat down to a meal, all sat down with us. Our driver, our hosts, us, our guards, we all sat to every meal together, and it was not a begrudging of company. Our hosts, who were university professors, included the guards and the drivers in conversation, making them one amongst us, which is Chinese style, not communist style. And there is a big difference. Communism is a foreign philosophy, but some elements of Chinese society mirror elements of Marxism. Don't confuse the two. The point is that the Chinese have a tremendous sense that all shall live or all shall die. And they're in this thing called existence, absolutely, together as one. I'm not Chinese, nor could I ever be. I'm a Westerner, and even more Western than that, for I'm of the American West, so it could never be my society. But it doesn't mean I can't pull a book off the shelf, nor meet with Chinese people to get to know their culture and get to understand just what it is that we are up against in competing in this world. If they have selected careful engineers and well-educated people to lead the way, and did Northern Chinese style to give women a place at the table, we can do the same. In ancient China, a village would sponsor a bright little boy and pay for his education altogether, so that he might have an equal chance with other Chinese who were well off. You might argue that great flaws exist in Chinese culture and society, and this and that lack of humanitarian cause that you focus on. But I say, look at China. Look at who she has always been. Take off your blinders. The last time I checked, China was doing pretty good. And if you run around in their cities, there is a sense of life and exuberance. Exuberance being the cherry on the parfait of life, which they did not have when my generation was growing up. In their way, they move forward, and move forward well. Why don't we do the same? In our inner city, there are plenty of bright children who could be lifted up. There's certainly an Einstein amongst them. But what does the inner city Einstein do with his or her time in the present order of things? You mean to say, America, with all of our treasure and goodness, that we can't bring this village child out and up? The Chinese target their needs and work to fulfill said needs. They set their minds to fulfilling what has been identified as a need. Incidentally, apparently, the Chinese are not bogged down with their supposed bureaucracies. Apparently, the Chinese don't need to chat up one another. There is decision-making and decision fulfillment. I suspect that the policies in Sudan are much the same. They have a need, they solve the problem, and they get on with it, and end up with tankers filled with oil. The overly concerned Western analysis of how China manages things with a theoretically disorganized, cumbersome bureaucracy doesn't seem to affect her progress, which begs the question of the notion of cumbersome bureaucracies existing at all. I have heard professors say the Chinese policy in Africa is disorganized, a product of cumbersome bureaus that don't know what one another is doing. Where are such notions coming from? For those interested in political consequences of the Chinese in Africa, there seems little interest in flipping back the textbook to read through the behavior of Europe and Africa, and by extension, their complicity in raising one tribe over the other, in creating the modern Middle East. One has only to flip over the freshly inked pages of recent Libyan history. One thing is for certain: China would like oil, and is likely, like any businessman, to want the business end of things untrampled by conflict. Strife just makes things more difficult, and therefore is not attractive to the businessman. It is not in the mission of China. She does what she does to get those barrels of oil or whatever else she needs. China is not surprised at the criticism. She has dealt with the outer bands of barbarians forever. If they want to clobber one another, as in the internecine wars of Africa, well, whose business is that? Anyone critical of China ought to note that much opposition to the United States internally and externally is due to our perceived interference with the internal affairs of others and our policy of nation building. The Chinese have arrived, and with that arrival they have come with a prefabbed scarlet letter attached. It's quite the usual conundrum, the damned if you do and damned if you don't conundrum. And that is what China is discovering as she pushes through as a competitor with the West. She is finally the new Jew on the block, as President Sukarno, late of Indonesia, was once fond of saying of the Chinese in Southeast Asia. Finally, do we really want to estrange China? Do we want her to team up with oil-rich Russia? Let us judge the world as it exists today and use our brains to deal with it before it's too late. Am I the only one who feels that dreadful chill when staring at the debt clock? If China is stealing our secrets, we hardly have the secrets appropriately locked up. I abhor the notion that our secrets are being stolen, but even more I abhor our inability to figure out the maths, to prevent that from happening. If it is a reality, we ought to deal with it. National security and education are one and the same. By the way, I think we are, and we will be the better for it. For in understanding how and why the Chinese are doing it, we will meet China as a more equal partner in the future. And she will respect that. As far as understanding that there are two sides to a coin, let me say this. Every year in Denver there is a Columbus Day parade. I have covered these parades and have had very scary moments amongst some protesters. However, Columbus means something entirely different in Central and South America, and to anyone who is a descendant of Portuguese and Spanish Jews. A friend from the Dominican Republic put it to me like this: Columbus is our saint and our hero because he did one thing. He emptied the prisons of El Supremo, the prisons of the Inquisition, and brought as many Jews as could fit into the holds of his ships from Spain to the New World, as others did. By the way, it's a page of history which needs its own restoration. Columbus was our salvation, and we shall never forget him. We find nothing to forgive about him. For everyone else, Columbus is a symbol of imperialism gone mad. But for all of those others, he is sanctified, a god who remains in the hearts of the misbegotten and forgotten Jews of the fires for over 500 years. We ought to see both sides of the Chinese question, try to understand what China is in the 21st century, and then, well educated, we can make our decisions of how the world and China fit together. I'm not advocating anything other than our own education, so that our decisions going forward are sure and right. Rather than whining about Chinese stealing our computer secrets, well, can't we meet them at the wall? If we are to meet China in Lake Pacifica, we will be ready. If not the unfolding of that dreadful scenario, we will come to understand who she is, so that we might all move forward together. We'd better know her, and know her thoroughly, for our own sake. Period. China and Russia fought terrible, horrible, internal and external wars. It is in both of their national consciousness. They have tasted that rare death, and for the last half a century have protected their people against such a fate. Although in the case of China, it has been a rather uneven experience, save the last few decades. That ought to be our beginning point, and it may be the key to peace. That dreadful remembering. Interestingly and ironically speaking, it just may be the key.